It is the 14th century, and Europe is about to face one of the most devastating events in human history. As the wind whispers through the narrow alleys of medieval towns and flickers of candlelight dance upon stone walls, an invisible terror creeps silently through villages, cities, and countrysides. Known to us now as the Black Plague or the Black Death, this catastrophic pandemic would wipe out a third to half of Europe's population in a matter of years, forever altering the course of history, reshaping societies, and changing how people understood life, death, and the divine. In this video, we will journey through the complete story of the Black Plague, from its obscure origins in the East to the horror it unleashed across the West. We will explore how it spread, what it did to the human body, how people responded to it, through faith, fear, and sometimes violence, and what legacies it left behind. So settle in, find a comfortable place, and let your mind gently follow the slow unraveling of this haunting, deeply human tale. We begin far from Europe, not in the cobbled streets of London or the forests of France, but in the vast steppes of Central Asia. Origins in the East, long before the plague struck Europe, it simmered in the shadows of the East. Many scholars trace the earliest outbreaks of what we now call the Black Death to the region around the Gobi Desert, in what is now modern-day Mongolia. The disease likely existed in animal reservoirs, most notably among rodents, such as marmots or rats, that harbored fleas infected with the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. In the Mongol Empire, a vast network of trade and communication called the Silk Road connected China with Europe and the Middle East. These trade routes were the arteries of the medieval world, carrying spices, silk, knowledge, and sadly, disease. The Mongols, great horsemen and conquerors, unknowingly became the first unwitting carriers of the Black Death, as their armies and trade caravans helped the plague travel swiftly westward. Reports from Chinese records in the early 1330s describe outbreaks of a mysterious illness in the province of Hubei. Villages were decimated, bodies piled up. The air was thick with death. Some described black swellings and sudden death. This was no ordinary disease. It was a storm on the horizon. As trade flourished under Mongol rule, so did the conditions for the spread of the plague. Traders brought the disease to major outposts like Samarkand and Baghdad, where dense urban populations and poor sanitation created a perfect breeding ground. And from there, it would only take a few short years for the Black Death to leap across continents. The Siege of Kaffa, one of the most infamous early episodes in the spread of the plague, occurred in the Crimean city of Kaffa, on the coast of the Black Sea. It was the year 1346. The city was a bustling Genoese trading post, an outpost of the Italian merchant empire. At the time, it was under siege by the Mongol army, led by the Khan Janibeg. According to historical accounts, the Mongols besieging Kaffa began to succumb to a strange and terrible disease. The symptoms were horrifying: fevers, black swellings in the armpits and groin, vomiting of blood, and almost certain death within days. The Mongols, perhaps desperate or vengeful, reportedly began using the corpses of their dead as biological weapons. They catapulted the bodies over the city walls in an attempt to infect the defenders. Whether or not this story is literally true, it reflects the terror and mystery that surrounded the disease even then. Fleeing the siege, Genoese sailors and merchants escaped by sea, but they didn't escape the plague. They brought it with them into Constantinople and eventually into Europe. Arrival in Europe. In 1347, the Black Death made its fateful entrance into Europe. It arrived through Sicily, carried aboard Genoese trading ships docking at the port of Messina. Local residents, who came to greet the returning sailors, were met with a terrifying sight. Most of the crew were either dead or dying. Those who survived had swollen lymph nodes, high fevers, and darkened, gangrenous skin. Within days, the disease had spread into the city. The ships continued to other ports along the Mediterranean, Marseille, Genoa, and Venice. With each stop, the plague took root. From Italy, it moved inland, following trade routes and rivers, carried by travelers, merchants, and infected rats. The speed of the plague's spread was astonishing. In just a year, it reached France and Spain. Another year, and it was in England, Germany, and Scandinavia. The disease did not discriminate. It struck cities and villages, nobles and peasants, monks and merchants alike. But what exactly was this disease that spread so rapidly and killed so viciously? The symptoms and science of death. The Black Death presented itself in several terrifying forms. The most common and most iconic was bubonic plague. Named after the buboes or swollen lymph nodes that developed under the arms, in the neck and around the groin, it caused excruciating pain and often turned the skin dark purple or black as tissues died, giving rise to the term Black Death. In many cases, the plague turned pneumonic, infecting the lungs and making the victim highly contagious via airborne droplets. This form was even more deadly and could kill within 1 or 2 days. In the rarest and most horrifying cases, the plague entered the bloodstream, causing septicemic plague, which almost always led to death within hours. The medical knowledge of the time was not equipped to handle such a crisis. Doctors believed in the theory of miasma, bad air, and often prescribed treatments that were not only ineffective, but harmful. People were told to carry flowers or herbs to ward off the foul smells, or to burn incense and purify the air. Some treatments involved bloodletting, or the application of leeches. Others relied on bizarre rituals or talismans. The infamous plague doctors, with their beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, became a chilling symbol of the times. People watched helplessly as loved ones fell ill and died. The death toll was staggering, and the horror of watching entire communities vanish within days left a deep psychological scar. Societal collapse. As the Black Death tore through Europe, it left chaos in its wake. Entire towns were wiped out. Fields lay fallow as farmers died or fled. Trade and commerce ground to a halt. In some regions, the death rate was so high that bodies were left unburied in the streets. Mass graves became common, and in some places, they simply couldn't bury the dead fast enough. The church, a central pillar of medieval life, struggled to explain the catastrophe. Priests and monks died in droves, often while caring for the sick. Some saw the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Others believed it was the work of evil spirits, or even witchcraft. Flagellant movements emerged, groups of people who wandered from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in hopes of atoning for the sins that had brought God's wrath upon the world. Meanwhile, fear bred suspicion. In some areas, minority communities, especially Jews, were scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells or practicing dark arts. Pogroms erupted and thousands were killed in violent purges. In the heart of Europe, where faith was the foundation of everyday life, the plague posed a devastating spiritual crisis. The Church, despite its influence and power, could offer no real protection or explanation. Prayers and processions were held in desperate attempts to ward off the disease. Bells tolled endlessly for the dead. Holy relics were paraded through the streets. But none of it worked. As more priests succumbed to the plague, many believers began to question the authority of the Church. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why were the innocent, the pious, the children dying in the same numbers as thieves and murderers? Doubt spread as quickly as the disease itself. In this void of understanding, folklore and superstition blossomed. People whispered tales of strange omens, a blood-red moon, comets streaking the sky, or visions of ghostly figures wandering the hillsides. Some claimed to have seen the Grim Reaper in the streets, cloaked in black, harvesting souls with an invisible scythe. In rural villages, age-old superstitions took root. Villagers burned herbs and performed rituals to banish evil spirits. Some even reverted to pagan customs, seeking the protection of ancient forces they barely remembered. Fear transformed the very structure of society. Families abandoned their sick. Neighbors locked their doors and refused to speak. Once close communities became islands of silence and suspicion. The toll and trauma. The scale of death is difficult to comprehend even today. In some cities, as many as 60 to 70% of the population perished. Florence, once a jewel of Italian culture, lost over half its people. In England, entire villages disappeared. The countryside was dotted with the silent remnants of once thriving settlements, now abandoned to the elements. In the city of Avignon, over 11,000 people died in a single month. So many corpses were buried that Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River, so that bodies thrown into it would be considered buried in holy ground. Gravediggers could not keep up. Coffins ran out. Bells that once rang for morning prayers now tolled only for funerals. Entire families vanished within days. The psychological impact was staggering. Children orphaned by the plague roamed the streets. Survivors were gripped by a strange mixture of guilt, dread, and numbness. For many, the world seemed to be ending. The trust in the natural order, of life, of death, of divine justice, was shattered. Some people turned to hedonism, believing the end of the world was nigh. They threw lavish feasts, drank heavily, and indulged in pleasures while they still could. If death was inevitable, they reasoned, it should come after one final joy. Others fell into despair. Suicide rates rose. In certain regions, people voluntarily buried themselves alive with the dead, unable to bear the weight of their grief. Scapegoats and violence tragedy often seeks an enemy to blame. As fear gripped Europe, suspicion turned outward. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells, a baseless accusation rooted in centuries of anti-Semitism. Across Europe, violence erupted against Jewish communities. In Strasbourg, thousands of Jews were burned alive. In Basel, an entire Jewish community was forced into a wooden house and set aflame. Other towns expelled their Jewish populations, confiscated their property, and destroyed their synagogues. These pogroms were not spontaneous. Often, they were led or condoned by local leaders who used the chaos to justify greed and prejudice. In the midst of plague, the darkest parts of the human heart surfaced. The horror of these events remains a stain on the history of the period. They revealed how fear, when left unchecked, can become hatred, and how suffering does not always bring people together. It can tear them violently apart. The plague's mysterious retreat. By the early 1350s, the Black Death began to fade. It did not vanish with a miracle, nor was it defeated by medicine. It simply slowed, burned out, and moved on. Historians believe that populations became so sparse that the disease found fewer and fewer hosts. Some immunity may have developed. The winter cold may have disrupted flea and rat populations. But as quietly as it had arrived, the plague withdrew. What it left behind was a continent forever changed. Europe had lost anywhere between 75 to 200 million people. Families were gone. Cities stood hollow. The old rhythms of life had been shattered, and nothing would be quite the same again. Yet, from this devastation, something unexpected began to bloom. A changed world. The aftermath of the Black Plague marked the beginning of deep societal change. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants could demand better wages. Serfs, once bound to the land, began to walk away and negotiate for better terms. In some regions, the feudal system began to unravel. Cities restructured their health systems. Quarantines became common. Plague doctors, though often ineffective, were paid by the city to treat the sick. Governments took more responsibility for public welfare. New institutions arose to care for orphans and the poor. Artists and writers were haunted by the imagery of the plague. Skeletons and grim reapers appeared in paintings and poetry. The dance of death became a common motif, a reminder that death came for all, rich or poor, saint or sinner. Some historians believe the trauma of the Black Death laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. As Europe rebuilt, there was a newfound urgency to explore life, beauty, science, and meaning. It had survived death. Now, it would seek life. To understand the true weight of the Black Plague, we must look closer. not just at the grand sweeps of history, but at the daily lives of ordinary people. What was it like to live through the plague? To wake each day unsure whether you or your loved ones would survive another night? Imagine a small village in England in 1349. A cobbler wakes before sunrise, expecting to mend shoes for the day, but his wife is coughing, her skin is pale, and her armpits are swollen. Within hours, she is delirious. He rushes to find a priest, but the local clergy is gone, dead or fled. The cobbler returns to find his home silent. His wife is gone. He wraps her body in linen, carries her to the edge of the village, and lays her in a pit with the others. No prayers, no final words, just silence and the buzzing of flies. The air smells of rot and smoke, of herbs burned to purify the air. And tomorrow, the cobbler may feel a cough coming on. This was the brutal normalcy of plague life. Markets emptied. Streets grew quiet. In major cities like Paris, bodies lined the roads. Donkeys collapsed mid-cart from the stench and the weight of corpses. The wealthy fled to their countryside estates, hoping distance would keep them safe. In many cases, it did not. The plague moved with a mind of its own, unstoppable, unrelenting. Servants abandoned households, inns closed, laws broke down. Across Europe, the fabric of society unraveled. Medicine and misunderstanding. Medical knowledge during the 14th century was rudimentary and steeped in superstition. The dominant theory of disease was the humoral theory, inherited from Greek thinkers like Galen and Hippocrates. According to this belief, the body was composed of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An illness was the result of imbalances between them. To rebalance the body, physicians prescribed a variety of sometimes grotesque treatments. Bloodletting was common, often worsening the patient's condition. Leeches were used. Poultices made of onions, herbs, or even crushed emeralds were applied to buboes. Some doctors recommended strange diets, no bath water, no fresh fruit, and sleeping on one's back with windows closed. Others insisted on opening windows wide and burning aromatic woods like sandalwood and pine. The famed plague doctors wore beaked masks filled with lavender, mint, and cloves. They believed these aromas would protect them from miasma, bad air thought to spread disease. The beak became iconic, not for its success, but because it symbolized humanity's desperate, confused effort to fight something it did not understand. Alchemy, astrology, and divine intervention were all invoked. Planets were blamed, curses were feared, and still the death toll rose. Global reach and forgotten victims. Though the Black Plague is most associated with Europe, it was a truly global pandemic. It spread across continents, touching lives from China to the Middle East to North Africa. In the Islamic world, cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Mecca suffered terribly. In the Arab world, scholars and physicians tried to understand the disease. Unlike in Europe, there was often greater emphasis on cleanliness and quarantine. Islamic medicine included more advanced hospitals and more cautious use of drugs. Yet, even these societies were overwhelmed. Entire regions depopulated. Religious scholars debated whether the plague was a punishment or a test of faith. In sub-Saharan Africa, historical records are limited, but archaeological and oral evidence suggests that parts of East Africa, connected by trade routes, were also struck. In Central Asia, trade centers along the Silk Road became ghost towns. Chinese records speak of waves of illness that devastated provinces. The disruption of trade and agriculture had ripple effects that lasted decades. And yet, most of these stories, those of shepherds in Persia, weavers in Damascus, fishermen along the Nile, remain untold. Their suffering is part of the collective silence history often leaves behind. Cultural reflections, art, literature, and death. The trauma of the plague etched itself into the cultural memory of Europe. Art became darker, more obsessed with mortality. The image of the danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged. A skeletal figure leading men, women, kings and beggars alike to their graves. It was a reminder that death spared no one. In literature, the plague inspired works of profound depth. One of the most famous was the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Written as the plague swept through Florence, the book tells the story of 10 young people who flee to the countryside to escape the disease. Each tells stories, comic, tragic, romantic, revealing a longing for life even in the shadow of death. Poetry reflected the despair and bewilderment of the times. Some verses begged for divine mercy, others cursed fate. Some chronicled daily life with chilling detail. The sound of carts rolling down cobblestone streets, the tolling of funeral bells, the whispered goodbyes at the thresholds of infected homes. Music changed too. Funeral dirges became common. Church choirs diminished as members died. In some regions, the joyful songs of spring festivals were replaced by laments. Even the rhythm of life changed. Time seemed slower, suspended, uncertain. Economic aftermath and the rise of the commoner. In the years following the plague, as the survivors began to rebuild, something unexpected happened. The death of millions had created a labor shortage. Fields needed plowing, workshops needed hands. The survivors, especially peasants and laborers, found themselves with newfound power. In England, the cost of labor rose sharply. Landowners had to offer better wages or incentives. Serfs, once bound to land by law and tradition, began to walk away from their lords. The rigid class system began to shift. This economic pressure led to uprisings. In 1381, England witnessed the Peasants' Revolt, an unprecedented rebellion where common folk demanded fair wages, reduced taxes, and freedom from serfdom. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, it marked a turning point in the struggle between rich and poor. Guilds gained influence in towns, merchants grew in power, Cities that had lost half their population found themselves at the heart of a new economic engine. In the long run, the plague had inadvertently helped dismantle the old feudal order. It sowed the seeds of capitalism, of labor rights, and of a middle class. Part 16. Seeds of the Renaissance. While the Black Death was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, its aftermath opened a path to something new. The questioning of old institutions, the re-evaluation of life's meaning, the demand for knowledge and reform, all of these currents helped give birth to the Renaissance. In Italy, where the plague had struck early and hard, cities like Florence, Milan, and Venice became centers of art, learning, and innovation. Painters like Giotto, and later Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, explored human anatomy and emotion with new depth. Humanism emerged, a philosophical stance emphasizing the value of human life, reason, and individual experience. The old order, built on divine authority and rigid hierarchy, began to give way to a world that celebrated inquiry, imagination, and potential. The Black Plague had confronted humanity with its fragility. The Renaissance was, in many ways, its answer, a celebration of life in defiance of death. As the decades passed, the spectre of the Black Death remained, though not always at the forefront of people's minds. It was not a single event with a clear beginning and end. It was a recurring horror. The first great wave between 1347 and 1351 had carved a deep scar across Europe, but it would not be the last. For centuries afterward, plague returned in cycles, each time reminding survivors that the darkness had never truly gone. In 1361, just over a decade after the initial devastation, a second outbreak swept across Europe. Known as the Children's Plague, it took a disproportionate toll on the young, those born since the first wave, and thus without any natural immunity. Villages that had only just begun to recover were once again thrust into mourning. Families that had rebuilt were shattered anew, and still, no cure was found, no explanation understood. These recurrent outbreaks continued well into the 15th and 16th centuries. London alone experienced major plague epidemics roughly every decade. The 17th century brought one of the most infamous resurgences, the Great Plague of London in 1665. By this time, the city had grown into a bustling metropolis, its narrow streets crowded with humanity, its alleys teeming with rats. Over 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the population, perished in that single year. The methods of dealing with plague evolved only slowly. Quarantine became a more structured practice. Ships arriving in Venice, for example, were required to anchor for 40 days, a period known as a 40 giorni, from which the word quarantine derives. Whole neighborhoods were sealed off. Red crosses were painted on doors, often with the chilling words, "Lord have mercy." In some cities, plague houses were created, places where the sick were taken and left to either recover or die. These buildings became places of dread, watched from a distance, avoided at all costs. Their windows were dark, their air stale, their stories mostly lost to time. Yet amidst this terror, the human spirit endured. Communities, however scarred, did not vanish. Life, always insistent, found ways to continue. Marriages were celebrated, children were born, markets reopened. Bells rang not only for the dead, but once again for the living. Throughout Europe, architecture changed. Towns and cities began to include broader streets, better drainage systems, and more deliberate public health measures. Though understanding of disease was still rooted in pre-modern beliefs, the experience of plague forced practical adaptations. Cleanliness, once considered secondary to spiritual purity, gained new importance. Water sources were regulated. Waste was more carefully managed. Governments, too, became more involved in public welfare. City councils established health boards. Surveillance systems were set up to monitor illness. The birth of public health, as a civic responsibility, can be traced directly to the centuries of grappling with plague. In art and literature, plague remained a powerful motif. The medieval world, once adorned with scenes of paradise and sainthood, began to embrace more somber visions. Memento mori, reminders of death, appeared in paintings, carvings, and even jewelry. Skulls, hourglasses, and withered flowers served as gentle, persistent nudges that life was fragile and brief. Despite the darkness, there were also gestures of compassion. In many cities, religious orders continued to care for the sick, even at great personal risk. In villages, neighbors shared what food they had. Parents, even when afraid, stayed beside their ailing children. There is no shortage of stories that show not only fear and flight, but bravery, tenderness, and sacrifice. As Europe entered the modern era, the Black Death left its final mark, not just in memory, but in transformation. The population decline had unexpected consequences. With fewer people to work the land, wages rose. Laborers could demand better conditions. Some became landowners themselves. The rigid hierarchies of medieval society began to soften. The relationship between people and the church changed too. The clergy's inability to protect the faithful from the plague led to growing skepticism. While some found renewed faith, others turned to more personal, inner forms of spirituality. The seeds of religious reform, which would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation, were sown in this disillusionment. Even language was reshaped. Entire dialects faded as communities disappeared. Latin, once the language of scholarship, gave way more quickly to vernacular tongues as local writers and thinkers stepped forward to describe their world, their fears, their hopes. The legacy of the Black Death also extended into science. The repeated exposure to mass death spurred physicians and scholars to study disease more seriously. Universities added new medical faculties. Anatomy, once restricted by religious taboo, became a field of exploration. Observation and evidence began to challenge superstition. Eventually, centuries after the first outbreaks, scientists would identify the bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, named for Alexander Yersin, who isolated it in 1894. They would learn that fleas carried the bacterium and that rats acted as the primary hosts. They would discover that improved sanitation, pest control, and antibiotics could contain the disease. But those revelations would come long after the damage was done. Today, The Black Death remains one of the most haunting chapters in human history. It decimated populations, shattered economies, and rewrote cultures. And yet, it also revealed the resilience of humanity. Through death, it reshaped life. The silence of an abandoned village, the echo of a priest's last prayer, the soot-streaked face of a child watching smoke rise from the funeral pyre. These are not just remnants of a distant past. They are echoes of who we are, of how we endure, of what it means to be human in the face of the unimaginable. And so, as we look back across the centuries, let us not only see the plague as a story of horror, but also as a story of persistence, of rebuilding, of memory, and of the quiet strength found in the hearts of those who chose, each morning, to rise again. Though the years passed and the plague retreated from its fiercest wave, its shadow never truly left. It lingered, not just in memory, but in the structures, behaviors, and emotional landscape of a battered Europe. Across every country it had touched, there remained scars, some visible, others woven silently into the cultural fabric of the world. Walk through a medieval European village in the aftermath, and you would sense the quiet difference. Buildings once vibrant stood in disrepair. The laughter of children, once echoing through narrow alleys and open fields, had grown hesitant. Weddings still took place, but with fewer guests and gentler music. The rhythm of life had slowed, rebalanced in the long hush that followed grief. Churchyards overflowed with the dead. In some places, bones were exhumed and placed in ossuaries to make room for new burials. These vast vaults of skulls and femurs became sacred libraries of mortality. The walls of monasteries, once painted with saints and salvation, now bore murals of skeletal parades, dancing figures holding scythes and hourglasses. The world had been confronted by death, not as a distant fear, but as a neighbor, a companion, a fact of daily life. Among the survivors, stories became currency. Grandparents whispered accounts of entire streets vanishing overnight. Children who had grown up during the plague were forever marked by it. Even those too young to understand would later remember the sound of weeping, the taste of boiled barley, the feel of cold hands pressed to warm foreheads. The plague left psychological wounds as deep as its physical devastation. Some people developed an almost obsessive relationship with cleanliness, fearing dirt and filth as gateways for death. Others became fatalistic, believing they had seen the worst the world had to offer, and that nothing else could surprise them. These emotional echoes reverberated for generations, passed silently like a shadow trailing the soul. Yet even in this long twilight, human creativity did not dim, it adapted. The arts responded with new voice and vision. The literature of the post-plague world became more introspective, more philosophical. Writers questioned the nature of suffering, the role of God, and the value of human life. From the trauma, a deeper kind of reflection emerged. Works that once idealized chivalry and romance now turn their eyes inward, exploring the boundaries of endurance and the weight of memory. In music, too, a transformation occurred. Gregorian chants, once stately and measured, took on a more haunting quality. Composers embraced dissonance and melancholy. Harmonies became more complex, perhaps mirroring the emotional complexity left by so much death. Music shifted from the heavens to the earth, from praise to mourning, from glory to grief. Daily life slowly took on a new shape. Marketplaces reopened, but bartering replaced gold in some areas. People wore amulets, not just for style, but for protection. Tiny relics of saints, bits of herbs sewn into cloth pouches, crosses of carved wood worn close to the chest. And across the continent, a kind of spiritual reorganization began. The plague had shaken the foundation of religious institutions. The clergy's inability to stop the spread of disease, to answer prayers with miracles, led to a crisis of faith. Some turned away from the church entirely. Others embraced fringe sects, mystics, and self-proclaimed prophets who offered new interpretations of divine justice. Pilgrimages surged in popularity. People took long journeys to distant cathedrals or supposed holy sites, hoping to find redemption or at least solace. Along dusty roads and mountain passes, travelers shared stories, prayers, and fears, finding companionship in their shared uncertainty. In the cities, as society rebuilt, a shift in class dynamics unfolded more dramatically. Once, nobility ruled by birthright. Now, wealth and labor gained new leverage. Merchants, craftsmen, and even former peasants began accumulating land and influence. A butcher who had once worked for a lord now owned the land he once rented. A mason, with so many lost to plague, could name his price. This redistribution of opportunity did not go unnoticed. Tensions flared. Laws were passed to freeze wages and prevent workers from demanding more. But the balance had already tipped. The old world was no longer sustainable. A new social mobility had begun, one forged not through revolution, but through necessity. Women too found new roles in the reshaped society. With male populations devastated, women took on responsibilities they had previously been denied. They ran businesses, managed estates, and in some cases, even led households with legal autonomy. Though progress was uneven and often temporary, the plague had opened a door, if only slightly, to a broader recognition of women's capabilities. In medicine, crude as it still was, the experience of plague forced change. Physicians began keeping more detailed records. Some abandoned ancient humoral theories in favor of empirical observation. Medical schools slowly revised their curricula. Anatomical study became less taboo, and autopsies, though controversial, grew more accepted as a necessary practice. The scientific method, still centuries from full bloom, began to take root. Colleges and universities, though decimated by deaths, eventually recovered and expanded. New disciplines emerged. Mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy all saw renewed interest as people sought to understand the invisible forces that governed the world. Knowledge became a form of protection, a way to prevent future catastrophe. Printing, still decades from invention, would later accelerate these changes, allowing ideas once locked in parchment to circulate freely. But even before the press, the plague had sparked a hunger for understanding that would eventually feed the fires of the Enlightenment. Meanwhile, the natural world, though ravaged, began its quiet recovery. Forests crept into abandoned fields. Rivers ran clearer without industry. In some regions, wildlife rebounded in the absence of human interference. Nature, indifferent to suffering, began to reclaim what had been lost. The great cities of Europe, scarred and half-empty, began to pulse with life again. Builders reconstructed cathedrals. Artists decorated new chapels. Statues were raised to saints, and in some cases to the victims themselves. Whole neighborhoods were renamed, streets realigned. Memory was built into stone. In Florence, in Paris, in London, in Constantinople, and beyond, the rhythms of life resumed, slowly, unevenly, but they resumed, and with every generation born after the plague, the horror became a story, then a memory, then a shadow, but not forgotten. The Black Death changed more than just demographics. It changed the way humans saw the world and their place within it. Mortality became more than a fear, it became a lens, one through which art, thought, and life itself would be seen anew. In time, the plague would become the backdrop to legends, to ghost stories, to historical lessons whispered by candlelight. It would shape future policies, fuel reforms, and haunt the imagination of generations to come. Yet, despite the sorrow humanity endured, it adapted, it grew, and in the wake of devastation, it dared to dream again. As you rest now, let the echoes of this story settle gently in your mind, not as nightmares, but as reminders that we are part of a long, unbroken chain, that those who came before us knew pain, loss, and fear, and yet they persisted, and so do we. The centuries following the Black Plague's first devastation would carry its echoes far beyond the immediate aftermath. Though life resumed, it did so with new rules, unwritten, yet deeply felt. The world, once teeming with rigid patterns and unquestioned traditions, was now more fluid, more fragile, and in many ways more self-aware. In places where once the rhythm of life had been seasonal and cyclical, guided by feast days, market weeks, and harvest rituals, a new consciousness emerged. Time was no longer infinite. Mortality had become visible, and its presence infused everyday life with a quiet urgency. The plague had carved an awareness into the European psyche, an awareness of how quickly all things could fall away. That awareness bred both fear and inspiration. For some, it led to a retreat from the world, into monastic orders or private solitude. For others, it became a source of creative fire, a push to paint, to write, to build, and to express what life meant while it still could be lived. Philosophers began to question the nature of destiny and divine will. If the plague struck saints and sinners alike, what did that say about providence? About the structure of the cosmos? If prayer could not save the innocent, what power did the heavens truly hold? These were not atheistic thoughts. Atheism as a concept was rare in the 14th and 15th centuries, but they were seeds of inquiry that would grow into the secular philosophies of later eras. In cities and towns, the rebuilding took many forms. Urban design subtly shifted to reflect new priorities. In Venice, where narrow alleyways once channeled crowds shoulder to shoulder, new regulations encouraged wider streets and better drainage. In Paris, attempts were made to control the rat population. In London, wooden houses gave way to stone in some quarters, as fire and plague had both shown the dangers of unchecked decay. These were early steps, clumsy, often reactive, but they marked the beginning of urban public policy shaped not just by economics or religion, but by health and survival. Across the continent, wealth changed hands with startling speed. Nobility, unable to maintain their vast estates without labour, were forced to sell lands. Merchants bought them. Artisans inherited them. Social boundaries, once thought permanent, became negotiable. This slow redistribution of power created a foundation for the urban middle classes that would flourish in the coming centuries. In the countryside, entire swaths of abandoned farmland returned to wilderness. Forests regrew. Wolves and bears reclaimed their ancient hunting grounds. Nature expanded into places once tamed by man. In some regions, these changes became permanent. The shape of the land was altered not by war or conquest, but by silence. The church, battered but not broken, also evolved. In an effort to restore its shaken authority, it launched new charitable initiatives. Hospitals, orphanages, and almshouses were expanded or founded anew. Saints of healing were venerated with new fervour. Pilgrimage routes were reopened. Shrines became busier than ever. And yet, alongside the institutional efforts, a quieter movement stirred. Mysticism grew popular, particularly among women. In the writings of visionaries like Julian of Norwich or Catherine of Siena, one finds a spirituality rooted not in fear of hell, but in the intimacy of personal experience with the divine. These were the early notes of a spiritual shift, away from hierarchy and toward the internal world of the soul. Among ordinary people, too, spiritual expression diversified. Folk beliefs, often suppressed, crept back into everyday practice. Charms, herbal remedies, and protective chants were whispered in corners of kitchens and barns. Christianity remained the dominant faith, but it now shared space, uneasily and often unconsciously, with ancestral practices older than Rome. In art, the face of death changed. No longer merely a grim finality, it became a subject of paradox, terrible, yes, but also oddly compelling. Skeletons danced, grinned, whispered in the ears of kings. Painters explored the moment of death not as an end, but as a passage, a door framed by both sorrow and light. The Book of Hours, a popular devotional text among the laity, began including illustrations of death visiting nobles, peasants, and merchants alike. These were reminders not to despair, but to live virtuously and mindfully, for none knew the hour of their own departure. Education, which had suffered during the worst years of plague, rebounded with energy. Universities reopened, students flooded in, eager not only to study theology, but also the natural world, mathematics, language, and logic. In Florence, Padua, and Paris, ideas flourished. The questions raised by the plague, why do we suffer? What is life for? Would feed directly into the come-in humanist movement. And it was here, in this shift toward humanism, that the deepest legacy of the Black Death began to unfold. For centuries, Europe had been a theocentric society, one where God was at the center of all things, and human beings existed as flawed, transient creations. But in the wake of the plague, this began to tilt. Slowly, subtly, the gaze turned inward. Man became a subject worth studying. Human potential, intellect, and creativity were celebrated not just as reflections of God, but as worthy in their own right. This philosophical pivot would ultimately flower in the Renaissance, a rebirth born, paradoxically, from death. In this new world, artists became celebrated as individuals, not anonymous servants of the church. Writers began composing in the vernacular. Architects designed with proportion and perspective, reflecting the harmony of the cosmos and of the human form. Science, once tethered to doctrine, began its slow emancipation. And though centuries would pass before the scientific method fully matured, its birth was seeded here, in the soot and silence left by plague. The story of the Black Death is not a single tale. It is a web, a convergence of suffering, survival, transformation, and rebirth. It is the shadow that lingered in the corners of bright new ideas. It is the silence behind the laughter at reborn festivals. It is the echo of loss woven into the triumphs of future generations. Even today, the lessons of the Black Death speak to us. In every public health system, in every act of urban planning, in every debate about freedom and safety, its fingerprint remains. It reminds us that fragility and resilience are not opposites, but partners. That to lose greatly is not to be broken, but to be changed. And that from the deepest grief, humanity has always found ways to reach for the light again. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift gently through the centuries. Listen to the quiet murmur of time passing, to the stories carried in stone and memory. And as you rest, know that you are part of that same enduring thread, the one that has always and will always continue forward. As the decades slipped into centuries, the memory of the Black Death began to shift. What was once a lived experience, raw, immediate, and visceral, slowly transformed into legend, folklore, and historical cautionary tale. But in that transformation, its legacy endured. Throughout Europe, communities that had once been erased began to reappear in chronicles, not as bustling towns or farmlands, but as ghost names on old maps, places that once were. Cartographers would sometimes mark these vanished villages with tiny crosses or use Latin notations like desolata est. It has been made desolate. Ruined stone churches, half consumed by ivy, stood as silent sentinels to the lives lost. In these ruins, people told stories. They spoke of towns cursed by sin, or punished by heaven, or buried in darkness. Children were warned not to stray near the abandoned fields. Superstitions took root in the spaces plague had left behind. And so, in many ways, the Black Death survived not just in the written word, but in the whispered fear of forgotten places. Yet not all that remained was rooted in fear. In cities that had rebuilt, new generations were born with no direct memory of the plague, but surrounded by its quiet consequences. They grew up in a world where laborers were paid better, where cities had health boards, where the poor sometimes received alms not from nobles, but from civic authorities. The old world had changed, and this new generation assumed those changes as normal. The cultural output of this time was steeped in a tension between reverence and rebellion. On one hand, there was a deep respect for tradition, for the saints, the sacraments, the rituals that had comforted so many during the dark years. On the other, there was a new boldness, a desire to push boundaries, to test ideas. Artists painted with greater realism. Writers questioned authority with more confidence. And thinkers, those who would become the early scientists and reformers of the modern age, began to peer into nature not with dread, but with curiosity. By the 16th century, the early stirrings of modern medicine began to take hold. Anatomy textbooks were written. Dissections, once taboo, became part of medical training. Plague doctors no longer relied solely on aromatic herbs and beaked masks, but began to observe patterns. Who survived? Who did not? And why? Epidemics still occurred, often with terrifying swiftness, but responses became more organized. In Milan, infected households were sealed off with guards. In Venice, plague hospitals, lazarettos, were built on islands to keep the sick separate from the healthy. In England, whole parishes were isolated by mutual consent, as in the famous case of the village of Eyam, which chose to quarantine itself to protect surrounding communities. These actions were not always successful, but they marked a change, a collective understanding that illness was not just divine judgment, but something that moved through bodies, through contact, through proximity. This realization, however primitive, laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology. The spiritual dimension of plague also continued to evolve. In Catholic countries, devotions to saints like Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, both associated with healing and protection, grew in popularity. Churches dedicated to them were erected in towns newly spared from outbreak. Processions continued, but with added rituals. Flagellants disappeared, but candles were lit, holy water was sprinkled, and relics were paraded on feast days with solemn purpose. Meanwhile, the Reformation swept across parts of Europe, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and reshaping spiritual life. In some Protestant regions, the emphasis shifted from saints and sacraments to scripture and personal prayer. This too was shaped by plague, the idea that one must face suffering without the assurance of intermediaries, that one's conscience stood alone before God, took deeper root in an age familiar with unexplainable death. In the New World, the legacy of European disease took a darker form. Though the Black Death itself did not reach the Americas, diseases brought by European explorers, smallpox, influenza, measles, wrought devastation among indigenous populations with no prior exposure or immunity. Historians often draw parallels between the Black Plague and these later epidemics, both in terms of mortality and the cultural trauma they inflicted. But for those living in post-plague Europe, the 17th century offered a strange mix of dread and hope. Plague still came, but so did printing presses. Fear remained, but so did exploration. People recalled the devastation, yet they also looked forward, uncertain but determined. In London, in the year 1665, the Great Plague struck with force. Diaries from the time, like those of Samuel Pepys, describe a city once again filled with death carts and silence. Grass grew in the streets. Dogs roamed freely. And yet, just a year later, the Great Fire of London, though devastating in its own right, burned down much of the city's crowded and unsanitary housing, effectively ending that particular cycle of plague. Some historians believe the fire, tragic though it was, helped purify the city. Others see it as symbolic, a fiery ending to centuries of plague and pestilence. From the ashes, London would rise, rebuilt with wider streets, better sanitation, and new architectural vision. As the 18th century dawned, plague began to retreat as a dominant force in European life. It didn't disappear entirely, but it faded, replaced by other threats: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. Yet it left behind a legacy not of terror alone, but of resilience. It had tested every part of society: faith, medicine, art, government. It had broken the old systems and forced the invention of new ones. And in doing so, it had made Europe not just sicker, but eventually stronger. The story of the Black Plague is one of immense sorrow, but it is also, undeniably, a story of survival. It is the story of how a civilization confronted its own mortality, was brought to the brink, and then, staggering, grieving, altered, found its way forward. As you close your eyes now, let the long arc of that story wrap around you like a blanket. Let the voices of the past settle like dust on quiet stone. Feel the pulse of life that endures through centuries, through fire and sickness, through fear and faith. Let sleep come gently. as it once did to those who survived, and began again. Even as the 18th century emerged with Enlightenment ideals and new discoveries, the memory of the Black Plague lingered, less as a living terror and more as a shadow in the archives of the mind. Yet while Europe slowly moved beyond the disease that had once crippled it, the plague had not entirely vanished from the world. It continued to appear sporadically and in unexpected places. One such resurgence occurred in the 19th century, far from the medieval cathedrals and castles of Europe. In the distant city of Yunnan, nestled in the mountains of China, a new wave of plague began to brew. The year was 1855. From Yunnan, the disease spread slowly at first, carried by trade and migration, until it reached Hong Kong by 1894. There, the world changed once again. In the port of Hong Kong, a young Swiss-French doctor named Alexandre Yersin was called to investigate the mysterious illness. With the backdrop of rising Western medical interest in bacteriology, Yersin worked tirelessly, dissecting the bodies of those who had died, examining tissues under primitive microscopes, and eventually isolating the cause, a microscopic bacillus later named Yersinia pestis in his honor. For the first time in human history, the enemy had a name. With this discovery came both relief and new responsibility. Knowing the agent of the plague meant new strategies could be developed, strategies rooted in science rather than superstition. Quarantine, pest control, sanitation, all gained renewed focus, not based on fear of divine wrath, but on a growing understanding of epidemiology. Still, this so-called third pandemic spread across continents. By the early 20th century, plague had reached India, killing millions. In port cities from Egypt to San Francisco, outbreaks caused panic, but also progress. Medical boards were established. Rats were trapped and studied. Fleas were examined under lenses. The invisible world was slowly becoming visible, and through all of it, the ancient memory of the Black Death served as both a warning and a guide. In literature, the plague remained a powerful metaphor. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe, in tales such as The Masque of the Red Death, drew on the historical horror of pestilence to explore themes of fate, inevitability, and the illusion of control. In music and painting, death retained its theatrical imagery. Hooded figures, skeletal dancers, pale hands reaching from darkened corners. But in science, the plague evolved from myth to subject. Researchers studied its patterns. Historians traced its paths across maps and manuscripts. Doctors recorded symptoms with clinical detachment. The monster had been domesticated in a sense, no longer a supernatural force, but a biological phenomenon. And yet, for all this progress, the emotional truth of the plague remained. Beneath the charts and petri dishes, there was still the haunting image of a mother holding a dying child. Still the empty streets, the locked doors, the mass graves. The trauma had imprinted itself not only on bodies, but on the soul of civilization. By the 20th century, antibiotics began to offer real hope. Streptomycin, discovered in the 1940s, proved effective against Yersinia pestis. With antibiotics, treatment became possible, sometimes even curative. The once unstoppable tide of death could now, in many cases, be halted with a few injections. But control did not mean eradication. Even today, the plague exists, though rarely. It lives in rodent populations across parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Occasionally, human cases appear. Most are caught early, treated quickly, and resolved. But its presence is a reminder. The ancient foe is never entirely gone. In our modern world, where technology hums in every pocket and satellites orbit above, the story of the Black Death still holds relevance. It speaks to more than disease. It speaks to the fragile thread that connects all human experience. It tells us how quickly the world can change, how deeply fear can shape society, and how resilient the human spirit can be when tested. The COVID-19 pandemic in the 21st century revived many of these reflections. Once again, streets fell quiet. Once again, masks were worn. Once again, fear, confusion, isolation, and grief touched millions. And in the silence of lockdowns, many found themselves thinking not only of the future, but of the past, of how humanity had faced such trials before. Museums dusted off old manuscripts. Historians were called upon to speak. Suddenly, the Black Plague was not just a distant curiosity, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, we saw both change and continuity. We saw that despite all our advancements, we still struggled with uncertainty, that despite centuries of progress, we still searched for meaning in suffering, that beneath the modern skin of our societies, the ancient heart still beat. We saw how fear could divide and how it could unite, how panic could inspire selfishness or courage, how systems could fail and be rebuilt. We remembered that humanity's greatest strength has never been in its immunity, but in its adaptability, in its capacity to learn, to remember, and to care. And so, as the story of the Black Plague draws to its close, let it not end in darkness. Let it end in quiet reflection. For this is not just a story about death. It is about life, about how fragile it is, about how beautiful it can be, about how, even in the shadow of great loss, we find ways to hold each other, to sing, to paint, to write, to survive. As you drift now into rest, let these echoes of history wrap around you, not with dread, but with gentleness. Let the lives of those who came before you whisper through time. You are not alone. You are part of something vast, something enduring, a story written across centuries, in moments of fear and in acts of hope. Sleep now beneath the same stars that watched over those who came before. Sleep in peace. In the waning chapters of the Black Plague's influence, we find ourselves in a time where the disease has passed from a lived memory to a studied history. Its lessons, hard-earned and deeply felt, became embedded in the foundations of modern life. But like all great events, the Black Death
never truly ended. Its presence can still be felt in the habits, the institutions, and even the psychology of the societies it transformed. Walk today through any ancient European city, and you might still find remnants of its impact. A chapel built in gratitude by plague survivors, a well-worn stone cross erected at the edge of town to mark a once quarantined border, alleyways widened not for trade but to reduce infection, and in the quiet spaces, under arches, in dim-lit cathedrals, in village folklore, the memory whispers still. One of the most enduring legacies of the plague is how it altered the relationship
between humans and the unknown. Before the plague, much of life was interpreted through a framework of divine order, unchanging, unquestioned, sacred. But after, even the most faithful began to wonder whether deeper knowledge could offer protection. Science, not as an enemy of religion, but as its companion, began to take root. This was not an immediate revolution, but rather a gradual awakening. People began to measure things more precisely. Time, distance, temperature, the spread of illness. The empirical world grew more tangible. Observation gained authority. A shift had begun from the mystical to the measurable. This transition gave rise to new thinkers, natural philosophers, alchemists, and eventually scientists, who carried with them both the memory of plague and the ambition to prevent such horror from ever returning. Their inquiries would eventually lead to discoveries in microbiology, vaccination, and public health. The curve from medieval suffering to modern medicine begins, in many ways, with the Black Plague. But just as important as the scientific changes were the emotional ones. A culture that had once feared death in the abstract had come face to face with it, repeatedly, brutally, personally. In response, a deeper, more nuanced view of mortality developed. Rather than simply dreading the end, many began to contemplate its meaning. Philosophers and poets meditated on the brevity of life, not to despair, but to celebrate the moment. The medieval world's obsession with the afterlife gave way to a Renaissance fascination with this life. This shift can be seen in the art of the time. Portraits began to depict not just saints, but ordinary people, merchants, mothers, children. Their eyes gazed not toward heaven, but outward, into the world. Landscapes became subjects worthy of attention. The human body, once seen as a vessel of sin, was studied and celebrated. The Renaissance was not born in spite of the plague, but partly because of it. The devastation had cleared a space, and into that space, new thought, new beauty, and new understanding poured in. In the realm of public policy, too, the plague's lessons endured. City leaders who once governed only trade and taxes now took on the responsibility of health. The first real public health systems were born. Quarantine laws, hospital funding, sanitation management. These became civic duties, essential to the function of urban life. Some of these systems, refined over centuries, still exist today. The very concept of contact tracing, for example, has its roots in early attempts to map the path of infection. The idea that health is not merely a personal matter, but a public one, began with the need to stop the spread of plague. And there was another, more subtle legacy, the resilience of community. In the face of unimaginable loss, people did not retreat entirely into themselves. They rebuilt. They came together. Churches reopened. Guilds resumed their meetings. Families gathered again in candlelit rooms, whispered prayers, baked bread, planted gardens. Even the act of storytelling became a form of healing. People shared their experiences, what they saw, what they feared, whom they lost. These stories passed down through generations, eventually shaped not just history, but identity. In some regions, yearly festivals were held to commemorate the end of the plague. These were not just religious observances, they were declarations. We are still here. We have endured. That sentiment of survival as a form of resistance echoes through time. It reminds us that suffering, while deeply human, does not define us. It is what follows that does, the rebuilding, the remembering, the living. As the modern era dawned, with trains and telegraphs, skyscrapers and steamships, the memory of the Black Plague faded from daily consciousness. But in the archives, in the bones beneath church floors, in the DNA of the bacteria still studied in labs, it lives on. Even in language, it lingers. The term quarantine, the image of the plague doctor's mask, the phrase ring around the rosy, often linked, though debated, to the signs of plague. These are fragments of a story that refuses to be entirely forgotten. In the modern psyche, plague remains a symbol, not just of disease, but of disruption. It represents the breaking of normal, the reminder that nature still holds power. And perhaps that is why, in times of crisis, humanity still looks back to the 14th century, not just to understand what happened, but to understand ourselves. The story of the Black Death is more than a medical history. It is a human story of fear and faith, loss and resilience, ignorance and discovery. It is a mirror reflecting both our worst vulnerabilities and our greatest strengths. As you rest now, breathing softly, know that the echoes of this tale are not meant to trouble you, but to comfort you. For they remind us that even in the darkest of times, there have always been those who tended the sick, who carried the flame, who wrote down what happened so others might understand. There is wisdom in remembering. There is peace in perspective. As the world moved further from the harrowing centuries of the Black Death, it carried within its heart a strange duality, a collective memory of devastation and a quiet reverence for survival. And though the plague no longer darkened the doorsteps of Europe with the same frequency, its story continued to ripple across the globe, influencing thought, science, spirituality, and culture in profound and sometimes invisible ways. In small, out of the way villages in Italy or France, you might still find an old wall carving of Saint Sebastian, arrows piercing his body, his face serene. He was one of the plague saints, called upon when hope was thin, when medicine had no answers. And though the names of doctors and emperors may have faded, those quiet images remain, witnesses to a time when people turned to faith not as a guarantee, but as a comfort. Faith remained a cornerstone in many places long after the plague receded, but it had changed. The church, once unquestioned, now shared space with reformers, with scholars, with thinkers who dared to ask why. The fear of God did not vanish, but it matured into something more nuanced, a reverence that allowed room for doubt, for inquiry, for self-reflection. In this space of change, universities flourished, the curricula expanded. No longer confined to the rigid study of scripture and classical rhetoric, students began exploring astronomy, medicine, natural philosophy. The stars were charted with new precision. The body was dissected with new care. Libraries grew, stocked not only with sermons, but with diagrams, formulas, and treatises. This intellectual renaissance, sparked in part by the social churn of plague, was not limited to Western Europe. In the Islamic world, where plague had also struck deeply, scholars preserved ancient knowledge and advanced fields like pharmacology, mathematics, and public health. In the East, in Ming China, despite massive population loss, order was re-established through bureaucratic strength and Confucian ideals. Humanity, in every corner, was adapting, but adaptation does not erase memory. In songs, in proverbs, in superstitions, the plague lived on. In the lullabies sung to children, there were lines about black flowers and falling ashes. In rural customs, people burned herbs on certain days, not fully remembering why, only that it was protection. In the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, a slight hesitation remained, a watchfulness, as if waiting for another dark cloud to rise over the horizon. It is said that trauma, when passed through generations, becomes instinct. And perhaps this is why, even now, so many of us feel a strange shiver at the mention of pandemics. Somewhere deep in the collective memory of humankind lies the echo of carts piled with the dead, of bells tolling endlessly, of prayers whispered into silence. And yet, it is not only fear that remains, there is also strength. Communities that rebuilt did so with greater intention. Water systems were engineered more carefully. Marketplaces were redesigned for better airflow. Governance grew more sophisticated. People had learned that survival was not simply endurance, it was innovation. Even the arts, born anew in this crucible, bore the marks of plague, but also its opposites: joy, beauty, sensuality, wonder. In the frescoes of Italian cathedrals, skeletons danced alongside lovers. In plays, characters confronted death not only with sorrow, but with wit and courage. Life, more than ever, was to be tasted. As the modern world unfolded, its empires rising and falling, its cities glowing brighter with gaslight and then electricity. The Black Death receded into history, but it never vanished. During times of crisis, people still looked back. During outbreaks of cholera, yellow fever, influenza, historians and doctors re-examined medieval accounts. What had worked? What had failed? What had we learned? And in those moments, the plague taught again. It taught that silence can be deadly, that the sharing of knowledge saves lives. It taught that health is a shared burden, that one sick village can affect an entire kingdom. It taught that compassion is not optional. It is the thread that holds civilization together in the darkest hours. In museums and archives, preserved behind glass, there are scraps of parchment written by trembling hands, letters from priests who had lost their whole parish, recipes for herbal cures hastily scribbled in margins, journals that record the deaths of entire families in a single sentence. These are not just relics, they are voices, and they still speak. As we continue tracing the legacy of the Black Death, it is critical to understand not only its immediate consequences, but its structural and long-term impacts on global history. By the end of the 14th century, plague had so deeply woven itself into the social, political, and economic fabric of Europe that entire systems had to be rebuilt or left behind. One of the most significant long-term effects was the fundamental transformation of labor systems. The dramatic drop in population, between 30% and 60% across Europe, created an unprecedented labor shortage. This scarcity of workers shifted the balance of power away from landowners and toward laborers, particularly in agriculture. Before the plague, feudalism had defined much of Europe's economic and social structure. Serfs were legally bound to the land they worked, and to the lords who owned it. They owed service, labor, and a portion of their produce in exchange for protection and a place to live. The system had been rigid for centuries. But with the deaths of millions of workers, landowners faced ruin unless they could convince others to till their fields. Peasants who survived began demanding wages for their work. Some moved to towns and cities, seeking higher-paying jobs. Landowners who refused to adapt found their lands fallow, their influence waning. Governments tried to intervene. England, for instance, passed the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers in 1351, laws that attempted to freeze wages and prevent labourers from seeking better terms. These efforts largely failed. Workers simply left regions with restrictive policies or rebelled. Tensions boiled over in uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where thousands marched to London demanding tax relief and the end of serfdom. These shifts catalyzed the decline of the feudal order. Over time, more peasants gained freedom from feudal obligations, and Europe saw the gradual emergence of a wage-based economy. This laid the groundwork for early capitalism, especially as trade expanded and cities grew more powerful. Alongside economic shifts came changes in land use and agriculture. With less demand for grain due to the reduced population, many landowners converted fields to pastures for sheep, which required fewer labourers and provided wool, a lucrative export. This shift further altered village life and contributed to the growth of the textile industry, especially in regions like Flanders and northern Italy. Another key transformation took place in urban centres. Plague struck cities hardest due to population density, but cities also rebounded more dynamically. With better wages available and growing trade networks, towns attracted rural migrants, skilled artisans, and merchants. The rise of the merchant class challenged the traditional dominance of the nobility and clergy. Guilds, the associations of craftsmen and traders, gained in strength. Many guilds opened membership to previously excluded groups to replenish their numbers. Some cities established new regulations to manage hygiene and waste, learning from their experiences with contagion. These efforts were rudimentary, but they marked an early recognition that public health was a civic concern. In the intellectual realm, the plague catalyzed a deep re-evaluation of knowledge and authority. People began to ask why such suffering had occurred, and why the institutions that claimed divine insight had failed to prevent it. Universities expanded their curricula beyond purely theological studies, embracing natural philosophy, medicine, and law. Writers like Petrarch, who lived through the pandemic, express both grief and a sense of awakening. He mourned the death of friends and cultural decline, but also urged a return to classical learning and the pursuit of virtue. This humanistic spirit helped shape the Renaissance. Art and architecture were equally transformed. In the decades after the plague, Europe witnessed an explosion of creative energy, particularly in Italian city-states like Florence, Siena, and Venice. Artists began exploring human anatomy, proportion, and emotion with unprecedented depth. The human body, once a symbol of frailty and sin, was now studied as a marvel of design. This artistic evolution was not divorced from plague memory. Death remained a theme, but it was now set alongside beauty, sensuality, and the material world. Painters depicted vanitas, still lifes with skulls, hourglasses, and fading flowers, to remind viewers of mortality, but also of the richness of life. In literature, writers increasingly turned to vernacular languages, reaching wider audiences. Boccaccio's Decameron, for example, written during the height of the Black Death in Florence, presents a group of young people escaping the city to tell stories. It reflects not only the fear and chaos of the plague, but also the human capacity for joy, wit, and storytelling in the face of despair. Politically, the plague challenged centralized authority. Monarchs and governments found themselves unable to control the spread of disease or provide adequate aid. In some cases, this led to a loss of legitimacy. In others, it prompted new forms of governance. Local councils, city magistrates, and emerging bureaucracies took on more responsibilities. This decentralization of power was an important step in the evolution of modern state systems. Demographically, the long-term effects of the plague led to shifts in settlement patterns. Some regions never recovered their former populations. Others, like parts of Eastern Europe, saw waves of migration and resettlement. Urbanization accelerated. Villages depopulated during the plague were often abandoned permanently, their lands absorbed into larger estates, or left to return to forest. Globally, the plague's waves in the 14th century and later had consequences beyond Europe. In the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of Africa, the disease disrupted trade, governance, and social structures. The weakening of Mongol control over the Silk Road, partly due to plague outbreaks, reduced overland trade and helped push European powers toward maritime exploration. This shift eventually launched the Age of Discovery and global colonialism. The cultural memory of the Black Death persisted for centuries, informing responses to later pandemics. When cholera spread in the 19th century, or when the 1918 influenza pandemic struck, governments, scientists, and communities drew comparisons to the medieval plague. Even today, the story of the Black Death serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization, the need for preparedness, and the value of scientific understanding. It remains a benchmark in the study of pandemics, a reference point for historians, epidemiologists, economists, and philosophers. The Black Death was more than a disaster. It was a turning point, a rupture in the medieval world that made possible many of the ideas, systems, and identities that followed. Its legacy is still alive in our institutions, our art, our cities, and our understanding of human resilience. To fully grasp the depth of the Black Death's impact, we must now turn our attention to the medical theories and public health practices of the period, both what people believed caused the plague and how they attempted to combat it. In the 14th century, medicine was still rooted in ancient theories, particularly those derived from the works of Hippocrates and Galen. The dominant model was humoral theory, which posited that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was understood as a balance among these fluids, and disease was believed to be caused by their imbalance. When the plague appeared, physicians tried to interpret its symptoms within this framework. The sudden swelling of lymph nodes, buboes, the high fever, the vomiting of blood, and rapid death did not fit neatly into existing models. Still, many medical texts recommended treatments like bloodletting or purging, meant to rebalance the humors. These treatments, however, were largely ineffective and often harmful. Alternative theories emerged quickly. One widely accepted explanation was that the plague was caused by miasma, bad air arising from decaying organic matter. This belief had ancient roots, but gained renewed traction during the Black Death. Physicians advised the public to avoid foul smells, to carry fragrant herbs like rosemary, lavender, or cloves, and to burn aromatic woods to purify the air. Cities implemented measures to clean streets, burn refuse, and relocate cemeteries outside city walls. While these efforts were based on incorrect theories, they sometimes had indirect benefits, such as improving sanitation and reducing rat populations. Astrology also played a significant role in plague theory. Many believed that a specific planetary conjunction, particularly the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in March 1345, had corrupted the air and initiated the plague. medical almanacs referenced planetary positions to predict the likelihood of illness, and physicians consulted astrological charts before treating patients. Other explanations were moral or theological. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for human sinfulness. This view led to public penance movements like the Flagellants, who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in acts of collective repentance. These groups were often disruptive and sometimes persecuted Jewish communities, whom they blamed for poisoning wells or angering God. Indeed, anti-Semitism surged during the Black Death. In cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and Cologne, Jews were accused of spreading the plague through malevolent acts. Many were expelled, tortured, or massacred. These persecutions were fueled by fear, religious fervor, and long-standing prejudices. Despite papal edicts condemning the violence, such attacks continued, resulting in the destruction of dozens of Jewish communities. Medical professionals in this period ranged from university-trained physicians to barber surgeons, apothecaries, herbalists, and midwives. Each had different roles and varying levels of knowledge. University doctors, often steeped in Latin texts, were respected, but sometimes less practical. Barber surgeons handled minor surgeries and bleeding. Apothecaries dispensed herbs and potions. Local healers often relied on traditional remedies passed through generations. Plague doctors, a new role that emerged during later outbreaks, wore the now iconic bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs. These masks, along with leather cloaks and gloves, were early attempts at personal protective equipment. Though primitive, they reflected a growing awareness that disease could be transmitted through proximity and touch. Hospitals, originally intended as places of religious charity rather than treatment, played a mixed role. Some served as quarantine centers, others became overwhelmed and served only to isolate the dying. In Venice, the first lazaretto, a plague hospital on an island, was established in 1423. The idea spread across Europe and became a cornerstone of plague response. Quarantine itself became a major public health innovation. Infected ships were required to anchor offshore for 40 days, from the Italian 40 giorni. The concept was based on biblical and classical precedent and became standardized by many port cities. Though not always effective due to asymptomatic transmission, quarantines marked a critical shift toward organized disease control. Beyond the immediate crisis, the Black Death spurred a re-evaluation of medical practice. Some physicians began documenting symptoms and case outcomes more carefully. One of the most notable early medical texts on the plague, Compendium de Epidemia, was written by the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris. While still influenced by older theories, it represented an early attempt at systematic public health advice. In the Islamic world, scholars like Ibn al-Khatib of Granada observed that plague spread through contagion and that those who fled infected areas were less likely to die. His insights anticipated modern understanding, but were controversial at the time because they contradicted religious teachings about predestination. Over the following centuries, this tension between tradition and observation deepened. Slowly, as universities grew and printing spread knowledge, empirical methods gained ground. By the 17th and 18th centuries, plague treatises often included case studies, mortality data, and attempts to model disease patterns, primitive precursors to epidemiology. Still, the bacterium responsible for plague, Yersinia pestis, would not be identified until 1894 by Alexandra Yersin during the third pandemic. It was then confirmed that the disease was primarily transmitted by fleas carried by black rats and, in the case of pneumonic plague, via airborne droplets from infected humans. This discovery brought clarity to centuries of confusion and allowed for more effective control measures. With antibiotics developed in the 20th century, especially streptomycin, the disease became treatable. Today, plague is rare and largely confined to rural areas with poor sanitation, but it is still monitored and occasionally flares up. The Black Death was a crucible in which early modern medicine was forged. It revealed the inadequacies of inherited wisdom, the cruelty of scapegoating, and the need for organized public health. It also illustrated the human desire to understand suffering, even with limited tools and knowledge. In the end, the pandemic was not just a test of survival, but a catalyst for reform, a brutal but effective force for change in how we care for the sick, organize society, and seek knowledge. To fully appreciate the scale and consequence of the Black Death, we must move beyond Europe and explore how the pandemic affected other parts of the world. Although the most well-documented accounts come from European sources, the plague's origins, reach, and devastation were global in nature. Most historians agree that the origins of the Black Death lie in the steppes of Central Asia. This region, home to the Mongol Empire during the 13th and 14th centuries, was a vast, interconnected land network of trade routes and military outposts. It was also a natural habitat for rodent species that carried the fleas responsible for transmitting Yersinia pestis. The Mongol Empire, especially under Genghis Khan and his successors, had established a transcontinental domain connecting China, Persia, Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe. This Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas, but it also allowed diseases to travel quickly across great distances. One of the most significant early transmission events occurred during the siege of the Crimean port city of Kaffa in 1346. Mongol forces, reportedly suffering from the plague, are said to have catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. While this may be partly legend, it is clear that trade and war brought plague to the Black Sea, from where Genoese traders carried it to the Mediterranean. From there, it rapidly spread westward, but the eastward and southern impact is equally significant, though less often told. In the Middle East, the Black Death swept through Persia, Syria, and Egypt. Cairo, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, saw massive mortality. Contemporary Islamic historians such as Ibn al-Wadi and Ibn Khaldun describe the effects in detail. Ibn Khaldun, in particular, wrote about losing both of his parents to the plague and noted the death of scholars, administrators, and judges across the Islamic world. He observed that entire dynasties and knowledge systems were weakened or destroyed. In Anatolia, the collapse of local economies and power structures created openings for new political entities. The Ottomans still, a fledgling power in the mid-14th century, were able to expand partially because rival states were weakened by repeated plague waves. Thus, the disease indirectly shaped the political geography of the region for centuries to come. Further east, the impact of plague in China was profound. The Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols and ruling China at the time, faced numerous challenges: internal rebellion, financial instability, and environmental stress. The plague added to these pressures. Though records are less detailed than in Europe, it is estimated that China lost tens of millions of people. This depopulation, combined with widespread unrest, led to the collapse of the Yuan and the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Ming sought to restore Han Chinese traditions, rebuild infrastructure, and reassert control over a fractured country. In this sense, the plague contributed to a major dynastic shift in East Asia. In India, while contemporary records are sparse, archaeological and demographic data suggest outbreaks of plague and other diseases occurred as part of the larger global pandemic. Trade routes through Central Asia, Persia, and the Arabian Sea connected Indian markets to plague-affected regions, making transmission likely. In sub-Saharan Africa, trade routes linking the Islamic world with West and East Africa could have introduced plague, but the scale and impact are debated among historians due to limited records. Some studies suggest localized mortality and social disruption, but not the same demographic collapse seen in Eurasia. Interestingly, the Americas remained untouched by the Black Death during this period. The continents were isolated from Eurasian trade networks, and it was not until European colonization centuries later that infectious diseases, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, devastated indigenous populations. This historical gap would later have profound consequences when Europeans arrived with immunities acquired through centuries of exposure to diseases like plague. The global transmission of plague highlighted the vulnerability of interconnected societies. While globalization today is often thought of as a modern phenomenon, the plague revealed its ancient roots and its ancient risks. In the centuries after the initial pandemic, plague became endemic in many areas. It returned to Europe in waves roughly every 10 to 20 years through the 15th and 16th centuries. These were not as catastrophic as the first outbreak, but they continued to shape demography, urban planning, and social behavior. One particularly deadly outbreak, the Great Plague of London in 1665, killed around 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population. Public health measures, including quarantines, mass burials, and house markings, Lord of Mercy painted on doors, were implemented. Yet despite advances, there was still no clear understanding of transmission, and social disruption was immense. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, port cities such as Marseille in France and Messina in Sicily continued to suffer periodic outbreaks into the 18th century. The 1720 Marseille outbreak, one of the last major European plagues, killed nearly half the cities. Population. Detailed records from this event provide insight into containment strategies, mortality patterns, and government responses. By the 19th century, with improved maritime controls and the rise of modern medicine, plague outbreaks in Europe became rare. But in 1894, the third pandemic began in Yunnan, China, and spread to Hong Kong and India, killing millions. This was the pandemic during which Alexandre Yersin identified the plague bacillus and linked it to fleas on rats. The third pandemic also brought plague to the Americas, particularly through port cities like San Francisco. While these outbreaks were limited, they prompted new public health systems and research into rodent control, quarantine laws, and vaccination. Today, plague remains endemic in certain rural areas, particularly in Madagascar, parts of East Africa, Central Asia, and the American Southwest. However, modern surveillance, antibiotics, and public health interventions keep it largely contained. The global history of plague is a reminder that pandemics are not solely medical events. They are deeply human, shaped by trade, war, migration, governance, and belief. They expose the strengths and weaknesses of civilizations and often accelerate change. In the story of the Black Death, we see a pattern that echoes through history. A disease that begins in a remote region, spreads through commerce and conquest, devastates populations, provokes fear and scapegoating, and finally, forces innovation. It is a story repeated with smallpox, with cholera, with HIV, with COVID-19. But the Black Death remains unique in its scale and impact. It serves not only as a historical event, but as a lens through which to understand the intersection of biology and society. In the next part, we'll explore how the cultural imagination, memorialization, and historiography of the plague evolved from the medieval period to modern times, and how our understanding of it has changed over centuries of study. As we continue tracing the global and cultural legacy of the Black Death, we must look at how memory, representation, and historiography of the pandemic evolved from the late Middle Ages to the modern era. The way people understood and remembered the plague shifted significantly depending on time, place, and the prevailing worldview. Immediately following the devastation of the initial outbreak, Europe experienced what might be called a cultural and psychological reckoning. The trauma was so vast, so unprecedented, that it demanded expression through chronicles, sermons, rituals, and ultimately through art. The first wave of representation came in the form of direct documentation. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette in Paris and Giovanni Boccaccio in Florence captured the atmosphere of panic, confusion, and sorrow. They wrote of streets piled with corpses, of families abandoning each other, of clergymen who died in service and those who fled. These accounts are among the earliest attempts to record an event as it unfolded, intensely personal, often inconsistent, but invaluable to historians. Boccaccio's Decameron stands out as a seminal cultural response to the plague. Written during the outbreak, it frames its 100 stories within the context of 10 young people fleeing Florence to escape the disease. What follows is not just entertainment, but a reflection on life, death, love, virtue, and vice. The Decameron gives us a unique dual lens. It acknowledges suffering, but chooses to affirm the richness of human experience. The Black Death also reshaped visual culture, one of the most striking artistic genres to emerge in its wake was the danse macabre, the dance of death. These allegorical paintings and murals depicted death, often as a skeletal figure, dancing with people of all social classes, kings, popes, merchants, peasants, children. The message was simple, but profound. Death comes for all, regardless of rank or wealth. Danse macabre art spread rapidly across Europe in the 15th century. It appeared on church walls, manuscripts, and in town squares. It was both a moral warning and a societal equalizer. In a world where status had once guaranteed safety, the plague had proved otherwise. These images served as reminders that life was fleeting and that humility, repentance, and virtue were the only true defenses. Another powerful motif was the triumph of death. In frescoes like the famous one in Pisa's Camposanto, armies of skeletons march across fields, striking down the living. The message here is darker, more apocalyptic. This genre reflects the collective fear that perhaps the world was in decline, that civilization itself was vulnerable to total collapse. Yet not all artistic reactions were somber. Some responded with beauty. In the wake of the plague, the commissioning of altarpieces, chapels, and religious artworks increased dramatically. Survivors expressed gratitude through acts of devotion. Cities commissioned protective icons of saints believed to intercede against disease, especially Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch. These artworks were not just pious offerings, they were public declarations of resilience. Literature also evolved. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, shares some DNA with Boccaccio's work. Though not explicitly about the plague, it reflects a world reshaped by it. Characters from all walks of life, traveling together, sharing stories. The humor, irony, and moral ambiguity in Chaucer's tales reflect the complexity of a society grappling with moral and existential uncertainty. Theological responses also adapted. The Church, whose authority had been questioned due to its inability to halt the plague, began reasserting itself through new teachings. Preachers emphasized personal piety, confession, and penance. In some regions, mysticism flourished. Women like Julian of Norwich wrote visionary texts, interpreting suffering not as punishment, but as a pathway to divine understanding. Over time, however, as the memory of the plague faded from direct experience and became historical memory, its representation changed. In the Renaissance, scholars like Machiavelli and Erasmus referenced the plague in political and philosophical terms as a metaphor for instability or divine providence. In the Enlightenment, writers began to analyze the plague critically, seeking rational explanations and data rather than theological meaning. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the plague recast in literature as Gothic or symbolic. Mary Shelley's The Last Man and Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death use plague as a setting for exploring isolation, mortality, and the limits of human control. These works reflect a shift from communal trauma to individual psychology. Meanwhile, the actual study of plague advanced. Historical records were gathered and compared. In the 19th century, with the rise of modern historiography and the professionalization of academia, scholars began analyzing the Black Death not only for its horror, but for its consequences, demographic, economic, and political. The idea that the plague had helped usher in the Renaissance, challenge feudalism, and lay the foundation for modernity became a common thesis. In the 20th century, the study of the Black Death intersected with emerging disciplines such as epidemiology, medical history, and even environmental science. The development of paleogenetics allowed scientists to extract DNA from plague victims buried in mass graves. These studies confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis and helped trace the bacterium's evolution. More recently, interdisciplinary research has explored the broader implications of plague, its impact on labor markets, religious dissent, gender roles, mental health, and ecological systems. Historians now view the Black Death as not merely a health crisis, but as a transformative episode in the long arc of human development. The plague also lives on in public memory through place names, monuments, and rituals. In some European towns, annual processions still commemorate the end of local outbreaks. Plague columns, ornate stone pillars topped with religious icons, dot cities like Vienna and Prague, built in thanks for divine deliverance. Museums house plague masks, bells, manuscripts, and art, preserving not just the facts, but the feeling of the era. The idea of plague as metaphor has also returned with modern pandemics. In 1947, Albert Camus published The Plague, a novel that used an outbreak in an Algerian town as an allegory for fascism and moral resistance. In the 21st century, COVID-19 prompted a renewed interest in plague literature and history, as people sought guidance, parallels, and perspective. Throughout all these transformations, one constant remains. The Black Death continues to provoke reflection. It challenges us to consider how societies handle crisis, how institutions respond to the unknown, and how individuals make meaning in the face of collective trauma. Its legacy is not confined to the past. It continues to live in our imagination, our science, our cities, and our stories. In the centuries since the initial outbreak of the Black Death, humanity's understanding of the disease has undergone a radical transformation. What was once interpreted through the lenses of theology, astrology, and miasma theory is now approached with scientific rigor, genetic analysis, and interdisciplinary research. The key turning point came in 1894, during the third pandemic, when Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, working in Hong Kong, identified the bacterium responsible for plague. It was named Yersinia pestis in his honor. Working under challenging conditions and without modern laboratory equipment, Yersin observed the bacterium in the swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, of infected patients. Simultaneously, Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo, working in the same region, made similar discoveries. Though Yersin's identification proved more accurate, both scientists laid the foundation for modern plague biology. The understanding that Yersinia pestis was transmitted via fleas, particularly the Xenopsilla chiopis species, carried by rats, was another crucial development. The fleas become infected when feeding on a rat with septicemic plague. Once infected, the fleas' digestive systems become blocked, causing them to regurgitate the bacteria into the next host they bite, typically another rat or, in urban settings, a human. This realization fundamentally changed public health responses. It shifted focus from miasma to vector control, managing rodents and fleas. In the decades that followed, particularly during outbreaks in India and the United States, authorities began systematic efforts to limit rat populations, improve sanitation, and introduce quarantine regulations based on actual transmission routes. Antibiotics, developed in the mid-20th century, were a breakthrough in plague treatment. Streptomycin, tetracycline, and gentamicin became the standard therapies, able to cure even severe forms of the disease if administered early. This development transformed plague from a death sentence to a manageable infection. Still, outbreaks continued, particularly in regions with poor infrastructure. In Madagascar, for example, plague remains endemic and occasionally flares into epidemics, particularly during the rainy season when rats move closer to human settlements. Cases also appear sporadically in rural parts of the southwestern United States, particularly in New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. Today, organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, monitor plague as part of their global disease surveillance systems. While it is no longer a pandemic threat, the potential for bioterrorism and climate change induced shifts in rodent populations keep plague on the public health radar. Modern science has also deepened our historical understanding of the Black Death. In the last 2 decades, advances in paleogenetics, specifically the extraction of ancient DNA, aDNA, have allowed researchers to identify Yersinia pestis DNA in human remains buried in medieval plague pits. In 2011, a landmark study published in Nature confirmed that the strain of Y. pestis responsible for the Black Death had been recovered from a London cemetery. This proved conclusively that the medieval pandemic was caused by the same bacterium as the modern plague. Further research has traced the bacterium's genetic lineage, identifying a common ancestor strain from around 1280 to 1340 CE in Central Asia, confirming what many historians had speculated. The disease originated in that region and spread westward along trade routes. These studies also show how the plague evolved. Over time, the genetic material of Y. pestis changed, possibly accounting for differences in lethality, transmission speed, and geographic spread between outbreaks. For example, the strain that caused the Black Death may have been more virulent than those involved in later epidemics. In addition to genomics, archaeology has illuminated aspects of how people lived and died during the plague. Excavations of mass graves in England, Italy, and Germany have revealed details about burial practices, population health, and even trauma unrelated to the disease. For instance, some bodies show signs of nutritional stress before death, suggesting that famine and economic hardship exacerbated the impact of the plague. Combining archaeological data with historical records enables a more nuanced understanding. We know, for instance, that death tolls varied significantly by region and by wave. Some areas were spared in one cycle and devastated in the next. Coastal cities often suffered first and most severely, while remote rural areas might be affected months or even years later. Contemporary epidemiologists have also applied computer modeling to simulate how the Black Death spread. These models incorporate historical population density, trade routes, climate data, and rat ecology. Surprisingly, some studies suggest that person-to-person transmission of pneumonic plague, rather than the rat-flea pathway, may have played a more prominent role during certain phases of the pandemic, particularly in cold climates where rats were less active. The historical record is also being re-examined with a critical eye. Some traditional assumptions, such as uniform mortality rates or universal social collapse, are being replaced by more localized and complex interpretations. In some cities, strong governance limited mortality. In others, social structures fractured completely. The plague's impact was massive, but not monolithic. Furthermore, researchers are exploring the psychological and intergenerational effects of the plague. Some genetic studies suggest that the Black Death may have influenced the prevalence of certain immune system traits in modern European populations. Others examine how trauma, passed down through culture and possibly epigenetics, shaped responses to later pandemics. Environmental historians are also interested in how the Black Death altered land use and ecology. Reforestation in depopulated areas may have led to lower atmospheric carbon levels, possibly contributing to a short-term cooling trend, sometimes associated with the Little Ice Age. This theory remains debated, but highlights the ecological ripple effects of human events. In sum, the modern study of the Black Death is interdisciplinary, drawing on microbiology, history, anthropology, climatology, and more. It is a testament to how science can illuminate the past and help us prepare for the future. Understanding the Black Death today is not just about recounting tragedy. It's about seeing how disease has shaped societies, exposed weaknesses, inspired resilience, and ultimately led to profound transformations. As we near the conclusion of our journey through the history of the Black Death, it's important to consider how the plague's legacy continues to inform modern discussions about public health, crisis management, and the human condition. One of the most enduring impacts of the Black Death is the idea of population vulnerability. The plague reminded the world that no society, however advanced, is immune to collapse when confronted by an invisible threat. This theme has echoed through the centuries in the face of cholera, tuberculosis, the 1918 flu pandemic, HIV/AIDS, and most recently, COVID-19. Each of these global health events has drawn comparisons to the Black Death. In both scholarly research and popular media, the plague remains the archetype of disaster. Its image, black-robed doctors, mass graves, abandoned cities, has become symbolic shorthand for fear, helplessness, and institutional failure. Yet it also symbolizes adaptation, recovery, and resilience. Public health strategies developed during and after the Black Death laid the groundwork for how societies now respond to pandemics. Quarantine laws, border controls, epidemiological tracking, and community health offices all trace their ancestry back to the 14th and 15th centuries. Modern governments still rely on many of these frameworks, though now supplemented by advanced technology. Contact tracing, lockdowns, and infection modeling were used during recent global outbreaks and are direct intellectual descendants of plague-era innovations. The Black Death also continues to shape cultural memory. Literature, television, film, and video games regularly revisit its imagery, using the setting to explore moral decay, existential dread, or social breakdown. Often these depictions exaggerate, but they also reflect a continuing fascination with the fragility of civilization. Importantly, the study of the Black Death has also evolved to include more inclusive and diverse perspectives. Where older histories focused primarily on Western Europe, newer research incorporates the experiences of Muslim scholars, Eastern cities, and even marginalized communities within Europe, like women, the poor, and persecuted groups. This holistic approach is not just about justice, it's about accuracy. Plague did not discriminate, and neither should its history. In education, the Black Death now serves as a key case study in global history, medicine, and economics. It is used to teach systems thinking, the interconnectedness of human societies, and the unintended consequences of crises. It also underscores the need for empathy and cooperation in times of uncertainty. Today, plague remains rare but not extinct. Its study continues to yield new discoveries about the past and to prepare us for future challenges. Whether through a microscope or an archive, we continue to learn. The Black Death, once a shadow over the world, has become a mirror, reflecting not only the suffering it caused, but the innovation and compassion it inspired. The Black Death reshaped history. It dismantled old systems, challenged beliefs, and set the stage for a new world. Its legacy lives on in science, cities, art, and memory. From crisis came change, from tragedy, transformation. Even now, the story of the plague reminds us resilience is as old as fear, and renewal follows loss. That is the final lesson of the Black Death.